All right. Hello, everybody. This is Eric Hauge, Executive Director at Homeline, and you're joining us on Wednesday, September 23rd at 1:30 in the afternoon for another one of Homeline's weekly webinars discussing Minnesota tenant landlord law during the pandemic. Today, we're going to be joined both by Homeline's Managing Attorney and Hotline Director, Mike Vraa, to cover some of the current status and updates briefly related to the eviction suspensions and et cetera. And we'll also be joined then by Michael Dahl, Homeline's Public Policy Director, who will be sharing a little bit about sort of the broader issues that the peacetime emergency that is what continues to extend, for purposes of what a lot of the things we've talked about, continues to extend Minnesota's eviction suspension. Just some of the other issues that it captures, as well as sort of what has been going on logistically and politically at the Capitol when that gets extended. Just a reminder of what Homeline is. We are a statewide organization. Our main program is a free and confidential telephone or over internet email tenant hotline that provides legal advice to renters throughout the state. And we've advised over 250,000 renters since we opened. And we serve folks in English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong languages. Just a reminder, every week we're doing these on Wednesday afternoons. Next one will be next Wednesday, September 30th at 1:30. And as always, you can get previous recordings and other materials, FAQs that we've prepared on a variety of topics related to the pandemic on our website. So with that, I'm going to hand it over first to Mike Vraa.
Thanks, Eric. And just to be clear, both Mike and Michael and I work at Homeline. I go by Mike, he goes by Michael. Hopefully that'll make it easy enough to keep us separated. Looks like he's got better lighting than I do as well. But I'm going to talk at first, just the quick snapshot of where we are with the question that we've tried to answer since we started doing these webinars in mid-April, which is, when can landlords file evictions in Minnesota? And things haven't changed since last week or the week before that, but I will still summarize what we have. The first hurdle that a landlord would have to get past in order to be able to file an eviction here in Minnesota, let's say for non-payment of rent, which is the majority, the giant majority of evictions, well over 90% of evictions filed in Minnesota, is that the governor's moratorium on evictions remains intact. This moratorium is tied in time to the Peacetime Emergency Declaration that was created back in March and has been renewed every 30 days since then. But the eviction moratorium is tied to that Peacetime Emergency Declaration, a power that the governor has to unilaterally decide to continue to extend the eviction moratorium along with the peacetime emergency. Michael will be talking a lot more in depth about how that has sort of happened during that time, but that's still intact. It's still in place today. The next hurdle that a landlord would have to get past in order to be able to file an eviction is found in the CARES Act. The CARES Act was a massive bit of federal legislation that happened in late March that had many components to it, not simply an eviction moratorium, although there was an eviction ban that ended on July 25th. However, that eviction ban, although it's expired or sunsetted, has a requirement of a 30-day notice that a landlord has to give. So if the state moratorium got lifted tomorrow and there's no CDC order, which I haven't gotten to yet today, but if there was no CDC order, a landlord might still have to give a 30-day notice if they're in a building that's covered by the CARES Act. That type of building would be any building with a federal government subsidy, or even a place that has a federally backed mortgage, like through Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which probably only the owner would realistically know or be able to find out. But anyhow, that's the second hurdle that a landlord would have to get past in order to be able to file a non-payment of rent eviction in Minnesota. The third one is the newest. The CDC order So yeah, there was an executive order from the president, August, I want to say it was, that instructed the CDC to consider eviction prevention options. And so on, go ahead and go to the next slide if you would, Eric. Yeah, on September 4th, this order went into effect. And it's a federal law that bans all non-payment of rent evictions through the end of the calendar year. And so a landlord in Minnesota trying to file an eviction right now, again, the state moratorium is already in place. That moratorium takes priority. The CDC order explicitly defers to the state order because it's a stronger tenant protection. But if that state ban or moratorium was lifted, the CDC order would still be in place through the end of the calendar year, December 31st. It is, as mentioned last week, we talked about a court challenge that has already been filed against this ban. To say that it's unprecedented is pretty much an understatement. The CDC having this power takes some statutory liberties based on how the CDC is created. The law that gave them the argument to make this order is based on a rule that has historically been used for the concept of the CDC being able to make unilateral decisions about pests, even across state lines. And so, while the CDC's order or powers are broad, I'm not sure if they're that broad. We'll only know once a court starts to decide on this issue. But again, a Minnesota landlord thinking about filing an eviction against a tenant right now, hurdle 1, the Minnesota eviction moratorium. Hurdle 2, the CARES Act. Hurdle 3, the CDC order. And that's for evictions where there's non-payment of rent. There are other protections built into the Minnesota moratorium as well. That's one of the reasons why it's considered a stronger protection for tenants. But the primary protection it really offers is that a landlord cannot file an eviction for non-payment of rent. The CDC order, the CARES Act, the governor's moratorium on evictions, all of them make very clear that rent is still due. So since this all began, since COVID-19 started reshaping our world, we have gotten calls from tenants wondering how they go on a rent strike or whether they owe rent or whether they should just withhold their rent. And the short answer has been, at no point has it been the case in this state where tenants don't owe their rent. Every one of these orders points to that fact that the rent is still due. One small issue, it's not small to people dealing with it, but compared to an eviction, it's on the small side, is the late fees, whether late fees can be charged. Late fees were not allowed under the CARES Act. For a non-payment of case for a building that was covered with the CARES Act, there were no late fees allowed through July 25th. After that time, it looks like late fees are allowed pretty much wherever. The governor's moratorium did not ban late fees, nor does the CDC order ban late fees. So late fees are pretty likely to be fair game throughout. Okay, so that is a brief summary of our status of the eviction hurdles that a landlord has to get past in order to be able to file an eviction. We have a few questions that have been submitted already, and we're going to be focusing on, I guess, what I would call the political process or political questions that are submitted first. If we have time for straight up landlord-tenant legal questions about COVID-19 or others at the end, then we'll certainly get to those. But Michael is going to be talking about the public policy aspects and the legislative aspects and the executive aspects of the governor's order and sort of how it's come to be and where its latest phase is at. But what I'm trying to say is, if you have questions, submit them either through the chat or the Q&A. And when we get a chance, we will try to get to them. As mentioned, we already had a few that were submitted in advance, but we certainly plan to leave time every one of these sessions to answer your questions that come in. That being said, Michael Dahl is going to join us now. Are you unmuted, Michael?
No, I think I am.
Now he is. Yes, I hear you clearly. Thanks. Great. Thanks for joining us. And Public Policy Director. Is that the extent of your title? I can't remember. Is there more to it?
Nope, that's it.
Public Policy Director. So you've been with Homeline how long in the current shift, I guess we could call it?
Well, let's actually point that out. I was for 3 years or so with Homeline back around 2010. And for the current shift, I've been around for about a year and 9 months. So
Okay.
I've been dealing with these issues for a while.
And you've kind of been in the legislative process most of your career. Is that fair to say?
At least 25 years.
That's a lot of years. Okay, well, why don't we talk about the peacetime emergency executive orders? I'll let you sort of cover the slide, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, so basically, in response to the pandemic, the governor issued Executive Order 2001, and that declared the peacetime emergency and the power for the governor to do future things beyond that we'll be talking about later. When the legislature is not in session, actually, peacetime emergencies only last for 30 days. They then, if the governor wants an extension, he needs to declare one. And then there is a vote that is taken by the House and the Senate to figure out if they want to do that extension. It's been extended 6 times. 4 of those times have taken place outside the regular legislative session. And so special sessions have had to be called to do that extension. And there's been a disagreement between the House and the Senate, and they both need to agree for this to happen. So the disagreement between the House and the Senate on whether or not the emergency should be extended has kept it in place since it was first started in late March.
And when you say the House and the Senate have to agree, do you have to get like 2/3 of the Senate or the House to vote on something, or is it just a simple majority?
It's a simple majority vote that would have to take place, and I'll be going through the vote totals a little bit later on what it took to get the extension, what it would have taken to get the extension, and why it did not pass in the House of Representatives. And the last thing I'll say, you can see the list of emergent executive orders that took place, and there've been a number of executive orders connected to the peacetime emergency that have taken place since then. It's been, as you can see, as high as, I think, even more than 89 executive orders dealing with different aspects of how to address the pandemic.
Okay, and whenever you're ready for the next slide, you just tell Eric. And that's how
okay, the next slide.
Okay.
All right. So the peacetime emergency was 20-01, and dealing with evictions, the first order was Executive Order 2014, which went into effect, as the slide says, on March 24th, 2020. And it basically points out that for non-payment of rent, a landlord cannot evict someone or do something that changes the lease that would allow them to live in the property. The executive order was then extended outside the regular legislative session with Executive Order 2073, and that was on the 5th of June. Some slight changes that were made to the eviction suspension. And then more recently, there was one that rescinded the previous 2. It was announced on July 14th, and it went in effect partially because of some federal issues that were going on August 4th. It rescinded the earlier executive orders, put in some new exceptions and some new requirements that I'm going to leave to you, Mike, to sort of describe some of the differences to those that folks may have. But there have been these 3 orders related to eviction suspension, again, all of them protecting non-payment of rent, and they just added some things that were not allowed, or a reason that a landlord could evict a tenant because they were doing something improper on the property.
Right, and I'll just say the current status of 2079, instead of sort of summarizing each of the tweaks, is that now a landlord cannot file for non-payment of rent. They, however, can file if the tenant seriously endangers others on the premises, significantly damages property. Also, if they violate a specific state law, 504B.171, which has a list of things a tenant can't do in their property, have in their possession illegal drugs, illegal weapons, stolen property, engage in prostitution. There's a domestic abuse component as well. And also a landlord can evict for if they're going to move in themselves or a family member is going to move in. 2079 additionally gave tenants a little extra protection with some more notice requirements, along with an explicit statement that tenancy cannot be non-renewed or terminated currently, which is much different than an eviction where a court case is filed. But there's been sort of these pair of tweaks that happened. The original thrust of 20-14 was, we don't want people moving around that shouldn't be moving around, so we're going to stop evictions from happening. Plus, a lot of people have lost their jobs, and we're not going to penalize them societally by losing their homes at the same time. Seems to be sort of those dual stated goals that we've heard from a lot of different sources since that's happened. Eric, you want to go ahead and get us the next slide? Thanks.
Next slide. Okay, and I'm so not certain if we're doing a question and answer here, but I wanted to talk briefly on the votes for the peacetime emergency. As we already covered, a peacetime emergency is something that can be terminated by a majority of each house of the legislature. However, they both need to agree. The votes have happened during multiple special sessions. This is there have been 4, which I think I understand correctly is a record number of special sessions that have been called during outside the legislative sessions that usually happen beginning in either January or roughly around March on different years. There have been a number of things that have been impacted by a peacetime emergency. For instance, who can go to places, how many people can go to a place of worship at the same time, where and when can you eat in a restaurant, where do you eat in a restaurant? And those issues have come up inside the debates that happen at the legislature when these peacetime emergencies happen, but you'd be surprised that they don't take up as much time as you'd normally think. The topics of the debates are oftentimes more about the process of who's been involved and what involvement they want to have, and then also some partisanship that takes place. So, for example, evictions have been raised by the legislature when they've been talking about whether or not to extend the peacetime emergency. Restaurants and can they be open and how many people can they serve, at what capacity? Those issues have been raised in the legislative process, as have places of worship. And so they do get into substantive debates about where most recent policies or executive orders have gone. But more often than not, one side is arguing that the emergency, and this is the position taken by the Republican Senate, is that the emergency has passed, the legislature is a co-equal branch of government, and that they want to sit down with the governor and negotiate how to move forward, that that the emergency is gone, it's now time for the negotiations to take part between the two parties. It's been reported that Governor Walz disputes this, saying that he has offered to sit down with the leaders. I can't speak for or against that. I just know that there's some debate about whether or not there has been some give and take or negotiation that's been offered. In the Minnesota House, which is run by the Democrats, they've argued basically that we are still in an emergency and that only the governor can act swiftly enough to respond to different things that are happening, changing circumstances, or enacting and enforcing different advice that he's receiving from public health officials. As I said, I don't want to say that the debate is not substantive. Those issues that I raised earlier are talked about. Issue-based things are addressed, but the process is usually about how can we get all sides to come together, and then there's the partisan arguments that are made on both sides about whether or not there are merits to moving forward as they would propose. So
Michael, you've watched both the Senate and the House debate these issues?
yes.
Okay. So just some logistics. Which one takes longer? Does the Senate go faster than the House because they know that the vote is secure?
It kind of depends. Usually you'd expect something would last longer in the House because there's more people that want to speak and that they have particular issues that they want to speak to their constituency about. And I can certainly remember staying up past midnight watching a special session take place. But there are times where the Senate has debated something more extensively, and the House is essentially going through the same process, the process of getting to a point where they're saying, they actually don't have a vote on whether or not to extend the peacetime emergency. Instead, they have a debate about whether or not they can debate or want to debate the peacetime emergency. And that's been the topic that's been raised in each of these four special sessions. And I think it's fair to say that they've gotten shorter each time because they've raised the same arguments and the same people sort of want to have their say about whether or not the peacetime emergency is something that should be debated by the legislature or not in this time that they see as an emergency.
Again, another logistics question. Are these all being done remotely, or are people actually showing up at the Capitol to make their points?
So it's a mixture. There are people that are located inside the House and Senate chambers. It's a very small number. Usually it involves some of the people that want to do some of the speaking. There are people that are in different waiting rooms in the legislature and all distanced as well. And they get called in to provide their votes at different times as the voting process is happening. And then some people are at home and they're calling, just like I'm part of this call with you, and their dog is bothering them while they're trying to make a presentation. So if, first of all, that happens to me, my apologies, but that's actually the situation that some legislators are at their house and trying to sort of deal with life as it's happening for them at home.
And I'm sure you see some of each, but are most of these comments in your mind pre-scripted? They've already written down what they're going to say, or are they reactions to what other people have said, or how do they tend to
It's a pretty scripted time, and usually the caucuses get together beforehand to figure out who wants to say what.
So they don't duplicate.
Yeah. There can be special points of order, or one side wants to raise one issue that they think the other side has violated a House rule or a Senate rule on, and that may get into some uncharted territory or a bit of a surprise. But it is high drama because you don't get to see this stuff before it happens, but they know the arguments that are going to be raised usually as a part of the debate.
Now, when the special sessions normally get called in a normal year, my understanding is the governor is the only person that can call a special session, which I guess is still true here. If the governor decides not to renew the peacetime emergency, there would be no special session. But once the special session is called, only the legislature can actually end the special session at that point. Is that right?
That is correct. But in regular times, if a special session is called, usually you get together all three parties and they say, this is the extent of what it is we're going to talk about during this time frame. And so there have been times where, for instance, Governor Pawlenty called the special session right after regular session happened. And the legislature at that point was, well, we're going to take the time we need to deal with the issues we think need to be addressed in this special session. But usually what happens is, as I said, the three sides come together, they sign a document agreeing to what it is they're going to address in that time frame. And usually the agreements that they've formed beforehand, the governor does not want, not just usually, the governor does not want to call a special session where he or she does not know what that's going to result in.
Right. I mean, because just sort of a casual interest in special sessions, most Minnesota residents would say they seem to occur in June, maybe, when the government might be shut down. That's happened at least a few times in the last 10, 20 years. And so what you're saying is typically before they actually announce a special session, all the key players have come up with a deal. And the difference between that and what we have now is if the governor continues to extend each 30 days, a special session has to happen by law. And so it's not any pre-agreed upon agenda other than they'll talk about this. And they seem to be just not doing more, right? Neither the Senate or the House is like, well, let's talk about some other topics as well.
Well, and actually that's not the case. The Senate has continued meeting after they've debated the peacetime emergency, and they've considered, there's a number of commissioners that Governor Walz has appointed. Many of those commissioners have not been vetted by the Senate. And there would usually be a hearing, or there should be a hearing about whether or not that should happen, whether or not that person is deserving of the commissioner position, and they have the ability to fire that person. And so the past two special sessions, we've had commissioners removed from office, and who knows if that's going to go on as these special sessions carry on. The Senate is definitely wanting to wield some power in this process, and they're saying that this is, or at least I don't want to say that they're explicitly saying, but the impression is it's that we need to be a part of this debate more, and if not, we're going to continue making our way through commissioner approval or not.
So the sequence of things, the Senate has voted last time and the time before to end the peacetime emergency, and then they take up this issue about a commissioner.
Yes.
Okay. And this is incredibly confusing. I know the first time that I heard that, I was mystified as to what was going on, but the Senate simply hadn't confirmed these commissioners that were already in place long before COVID-19. Is that how it has worked?
Yes, that's been the way that it's happened, and so for different reasons that we don't need to go into here.
Is that common though? That commissioners are rarely actually confirmed by the Senate, that they just don't bother anymore?
My memory is not working as well as I'd like it to right now, but I have seen in other instances where a commissioner has not been approved, but it's not something. It's usually. And there have been times where many of the commissioners actually do receive approval from the Minnesota Senate. But of recent years, there have definitely been commissioners that continue in their position without a Senate process taking place.
Well, I assume this is going to set a tone in the future. If, let's say, next time up, Governor Walz loses his election, there's a Republican governor, and the Democrats control the Senate, but they're going to remember this. Like, hey, we'll never confirm any of your commissioners, and we'll have that as a potential tool to use against something you want at some point. Is this a new thing where the Senate is just withheld or actually basically fired in place commissioners?
And it isn't a new thing, but it's not something that has sort of happened within a process like this.
Sure.
And
there's no process like this before. Right?
Right. And so I don't want to speak too much to the, whatever may have happened in other instances, but there was probably a real beef that one party had with the governor's appointment, and the debate was more constrained to that issue. Now there may be some sort of retaliation that the other side brings up in response to that, but this is definitely some territory that you seems uncharted, and one where we would hope it wouldn't go down a spiral of unpredictability of how does one side want to sort of kick sand in the other's face.
So you mentioned the votes during the special sessions, but the votes haven't always been the same, the tallies. In the Senate, controlled by Republicans, they have voted every time they've had a chance since June to end the emergency powers, or the peacetime emergency, I should say. The House, controlled by Democrats, the vote has shifted since June, right? It's not always the same vote number.
Well, there have been cases where a Republican has been excused from a vote for the day, and so not as many Republicans vote for an ending of the peacetime emergency. Actually, the way that the vote has happened in the Senate has been that they have a vote to end the peacetime emergency, and in the House, the vote has been on whether or not they should even take up the debate.
Right, I understand, but that vote has been changing over time.
Right, and it's changing, and I just want to make that point because it has happened where there has been cases where a Republican is not available on a particular day, they have an excused absence. There's already going to be a foregone conclusion about the way the vote is going to go, and so they're not going to force everybody into the room, especially if someone has a special circumstance that they can't be there, Republican or Democrat. Definitely it has been, there have been two Democrats, at least two Democrats that I'm aware of that have voted with the Republicans in wanting to take up the debate of whether or not a peacetime emergency should take place. So, for example, Representative Pulowski, who's from District 28A, that's the Winona area, and Representative Paul Marquardt, who's from 4B, the Dilworth area. That those are two Democrats that have voted to have the debate for a peacetime, whether or not the peacetime emergency should be extended. And then depending on the situation, there have been at least a couple Democrats that have voted one time to vote to have the debate, another time to vote to not have the debate. Representative Sundin, who's from District 11A, that's ESCO, which is in the Cloquet area. And then also Representative Sandsted, 6A from Hibbing area, has been one of those that's voted one way, one special session, and one way on another.
And how close was the most recent vote?
The most recent vote was 24 ayes and 67 nays. And so it would take, I believe that would make
Whoa,
that two.
not 24, you mean 64, right?
64 ayes and 67 nays, sorry about that. And so if two votes had flipped, it would be a vote to have that debate of a peacetime emergency, whether or not it would be
if four more of those 67 were not voting that day.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And it hasn't been that close before. The last one we're talking about was September 11th. This is the closest vote we've seen.
It's the closest that we've seen, which basically has the caucuses
I think we lost Michael.
I think we did. There he is.
We lost you for a
the last
second.
word you said was caucuses, then we lost you.
Yeah, my phone rang and told me on my iPad that I should answer it. I declined. Basically, the caucuses get together and figure out who's going to vote which way and what do they need to do to make sure that they have the votes necessary to have the vote for the not taking up the debate on peacetime emergency on the Democrat side. And they do what they can on the Republican side to have as many votes that are in the I category for taking up the peacetime emergency.
Have any Republican House members voted to continue the governor's powers?
No.
Well, I mean, it sounds like one of the things you're kind of saying here is that you can't necessarily obviously read into every single vote because they're planning in advance sort of how it's going to play out. And what we've kind of heard consistently is that the House has been sort of standing and sticking with the governor's powers, right?
They have been, but there are some legislators that are in a position where the governor feels like he needs to stay in base, stay in touch with a small batch of Democrat House members to figure out where they are, and if they have issues, if there's anything that can be done as a part of, if there's any policy changes that need to be proposed, or executive orders that need to be ordered to keep them satisfied with what the current situation is.
I don't want to get too much into predictive stuff, but there's an election coming up, right? A big election. First of all, who was up for election in the state House and Senate this year? Is it everybody?
This session, I believe
I think it's everybody.
it's everybody, and that
Not the governor, but everybody else.
correct. And so that may have a role, and that's why some of the Democrats are in queasy positions. They're like not wanting to do something that their constituency is against and will remember at the polls.
There's only one more of these votes before the election, though, on October 12th. Then
I think
assuming
it's October
it got
11th.
assuming it got extended, then the
That
next
would be-
one in November would be past the election.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned this earlier. The other things that the peacetime emergency enables the governor to do.
Right.
So obviously there's the eviction moratorium that we care about, although frankly with the CDC protection in place, it's slightly less important from a tenant perspective because there's that federal fallback, although it's not anywhere near as protective of tenants as the Minnesota moratorium is. But what else is there again that the peacetime emergencies allow the governor to do? What benefits does the state get out of that? Not just the governor making decisions, but are there other things that entitles the state to?
Well, the first thing that the peacetime emergency, and I think there's only one other state that, there's only one state that does not have a peacetime emergency in place.
Do you know which one?
Is that North Dakota?
If it's a Dakota, I'm guessing it's South Dakota.
South Dakota. I'm guessing here. I'm
sorry. So every other state has a peacetime emergency in place.
Has some sort of a peacetime emergency that allows the governor to do something to address the pandemic. And if we were not to have the peacetime emergency in place, we'd be jeopardizing over $50 million each month in federal funding, according to Governor Walz. There are certain things that the peacetime emergency, I'm going to read something directly from the governor's website about what the peacetime emergency protects. It says that it protects Minnesotans against evictions and wage garnishment. I'm putting this in parentheses for consumer debt. It provides expedited procurement power for personal protective equipment, PPE, and other equipment. It allows Minnesota to reopen society strategically while allowing for the advice of public health experts. It protects workers from unsafe working conditions, requires Minnesotans to wear a face covering in certain settings to prevent the spread of COVID-19, and provides economic relief and stability to those impacted by the pandemic. So that's what's on the governor's website. You can also take a look at, and all you have to do is actually enter in Minnesota peacetime emergency orders, and you'll get a full listing of what the governor has put in place as far as additional things. And so Executive Order 20-85, authorizing and directing higher education institutions to provide safe and effective learning environments to their students. There's Executive Order 2080, which extends relief from regulations for motor carriers and drivers operating in Minnesota declared in Executive Orders 2024, 2044, 60, and 76. It also, there's an order that deals with the cooperative firefighting, health, and peace officers. There are just lots of different constituencies that I have a stake in. Is this peacetime emergency going to continue? And all of those parts play a role in sort of the politics of the situation.
Do you know if in other states there's this sort of every month kind of thumbs up or thumbs down vote happening on governors continuing peacetime emergencies?
Sorry, I'm not prepared to answer that question.
Okay, that's fine.
I
Eric,
I
do
think
you have,
I
do you
don't
have
know
something
the,
else before I get to some of the other questions that people have submitted?
No, I was gonna just not answer that, but say I don't know what the number is, but I know that there is other states where it's not in this kind of monthly type situation. They have kind of broader authority. Yeah, I mean, I was looking at that list that you mentioned. I put it in the chat too. All the executive orders in it. I mean, that list goes even back to last year, and not all of the executive orders on that page are directly relevant to the peacetime emergency. I mean, there's some of them were about the curfews in Minneapolis during the state of civil unrest. But there really is a lot of them that have been dependent on the ongoing peacetime emergency. From originally sort of closing things up, telling people to stay home, to then now slowly and safely reopening everything. I mean, there's things there's an order just allowing food trucks to operate at highway rest areas, guidance and regulation of homelessness encampments. One of them that allowed for the state unemployment insurance to be expedited and get out to people quickly. So really all over the place, and a lot of them, prioritizing certain types of medical procedures versus elective type things. So that's the only thing. Go ahead.
And the executive orders have, in many cases, been about how quickly to reopen certain things and under what requirements would they be held to in those situations. And you can see how there can be this political debate between the Republicans and the Democrats about wanting to be a part of that debate, feeling like the legislature has the ability to have a grasp on these issues because they have committees that deal specifically with matters of many of these topics. So one side saying that we ought to be at the table working these issues out together, that we initially wanted to have the peacetime emergency covering what we needed to have hospitals ready for what we were seeing as a surge in cases. And then the other side saying, wait a second, we're still seeing a growth in the number of people being impacted by COVID-19. We're still in an emergency. And so we need to even more slowly open things up, or at least trust that the governor has the ability to handle these things as they're happening, rather than going through legislative debate that can sometimes take a while for both sides to agree to.
I got a specific question about one of the topics that you brought up, which is the commissioners being non-confirmed, or not really fired, I guess isn't the right way to say it, but they just denied confirmation. Specifically about Commissioner Jennifer Ho. Is she a confirmed commissioner? Or what's the exact title of her department that she's the commissioner of?
So she's with Commissioner Ho is with Minnesota Housing, sometimes called Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and I think that there are, it depends on how quickly the legislature wanted to, or the Senate would want to go through this, but it does not seem like she's as high up in the priority list of things that the Senate Republicans would want to consider. Definitely, there are things, evictions are housing issues, and how does that interplay with the Housing Finance Agency? Actually, there's, this is one thing I have to bring up. There's two sides to to this coin. There are renters that aren't paying rent because they don't have the money to do so. We have landlords that, some smallish landlords that if they don't collect the rent, it's putting them in jeopardy with their mortgage. And so in addition to there being rules that there shouldn't be evictions except in the case of non-payment of rent, that the landlords need resources. And this is something that the state or federal government has the power to do. It's primarily a federal, the state and federal governments are not putting in the resources that tenants need to pay their rent for a situation where it's an economy that had many people laid off or reduced hours. And so both sides of the coin are not being met right now at this point.
I want to add a point to that if I can, Michael, and that's that, you know, regarding the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, Minnesota Housing, and the commissioner, you know, the eviction suspension orders really don't specify anything to do with Minnesota Housing. They don't oversee it or anything like that. It's the Attorney General's office, which is an elected position, not an agency head that gets put in place by the governor. That the AG's office has the authority. And
I took a slight sidetrack there, and it wasn't the best segue. Which is what you're saying is true. So taking up Commissioner Ho's name in a Senate debate may not make sense because she doesn't have the ability to enforce or work on a lot of these issues. But what she can do, and what the state can do and the federal government can do, is appropriate more dollars to help deal with this crisis that we're currently in, to deal with unpaid rent.
Right, and that's something they are doing. It may not be at the level that is needed, but I mean, we had folks from Minnesota Housing on a few weeks ago to talk about that new the COVID-19 housing assistance program, which I'll put the info in the chat again. So they are getting those dollars out the door, and you know, maybe if that were to happen with you know, it would impact the agency's ability to do that if there's sort of a fight about the commissioner.
Correct.
Michael, you mentioned the Commissioner Ho might not be, I guess, high enough in the target sites, maybe, of the Republicans. Couldn't they just do a massive non-confirmation of everybody that they feel like they have the power to confirm or not confirm? They don't have to do one at a time, right? Like they've been doing.
Procedurally, I think they'd have to do that one at a time, and they'd also be each time losing their power. I think sort of rolling these things out strategically is what is probably happening.
Oh, I see. Once they use it, then they can't do anything more about it. Basically, is what you're saying.
I mean, when a commissioner is no longer around, they're no longer around, and it's
Has the governor been appointing new commissioners for the ones that were effectively fired?
I don't believe that's happened in the two cases thus far.
So probably just interim people stepping in with no intention of nominating them as actual commissioners.
I'm not part of the hiring process that the governor is going through here, so I can't speak to that. But I just know that there have been interim folks set up in both times.
Got a couple other questions that I think are much more towards you than me. Something that I honestly don't know that I've heard of. What is the function of the Affordable Housing Committee headed by Representative, and there's a question mark here, Fisher, which will run for the next 5 years and has only met once? Do you know anything about the Affordable Housing Committee?
I think the Affordable Housing Committee has to do with actually how to make housing more affordable, and it might deal with rules, zoning issues. I hope I have this right, that this is what the commission is about. There's also a committee in the Senate that deals with has had debates about how to reduce the cost of housing, and so I believe that's the Representative Fisher item. And if I need to correct that, I will come back and do so, and we can send that out to folks who took part in this webinar. But I believe that's the commission that they're talking about.
So this is a specific question, but it's a fair question about almost any topic. That when new elected officials get into office, what are the chances that they could be trained about housing? Do you know what happens when you get these new officials elected? What kind of training they get in topics? I'm guessing that many legislators have expertise in one or even several topics, but they can't be experts at everything. So what kind of training happens for new legislators?
Well, I think I think they find very kind ways to say no to a lot of things, because there's just so much that people want. And I'm being very truthful there, is that it's hard to make commitments to everything. You listen to what your constituents' needs are, but it's more about the process of how the House operates. And then there's beyond that, there's a committee process that's set up. And there are some legislators that have been around for a long time. They've developed an expertise, let's say in housing issues, like Representative Alice Hausman knows a ton about housing issues. She's named chair of the Housing Committee, the Finance and Policy Committee in the House for Housing Issues. And then there's people that say that they want to sit on certain committees, and usually seniority has a role to play in whether or not you can sit on a certain committee or whether or not you get assigned to something because it's a spot that's available for you. So they don't get a training on all issues that help them make a decision on things. Oftentimes there are opinion leaders, like Representative Hausman is seen as an opinion leader by many people about affordable housing issues. The same might be said about Senator Westrom, that he would be seen as an expert on housing, and there'd be certain people that would rely on him for, hey, how should I vote on this particular issue? And there's also caucus debates that take place, and where the Democrats and the Republicans meet separately to figure out who's going to vote which way and what are the questions are going to come up. And that's also an opportunity for newly elected officials to sort of learn issues as they're going along. But over time, what happens is that people develop specialties, and they come to trust others to help them make a decision. That being paired with what are the desires of their constituencies, which they oftentimes send out surveys out to the community to figure out what's important to them.
But I know a couple people that have been elected to judge positions, district court judge, which is sort of the entry-level judge job at the state level. And they go to, they don't call it this, but it's basically a judge school for a set amount of time. And they're sort of trained on the mechanics of running the courtroom. There's not some parallel version of that for a legislator. They get to focus on whatever they wish to focus on that you know of.
Well, as I said before, I think that as far as procedures, what are the rules of what are the main rules of the House and the Senate? That yes, the legislators are taught some of those issues. They then, after they learn those issues, they then vie for what committees they want to serve on and become experts in that. But basically, someone knows. This is when I speak, this is how I address a certain legislator, here's how to keep up a certain level of decorum when the full House and the full Senate meet. And so, and that all debate goes through whoever is facilitating the floor session or the committee session. Much of that stuff comes up privately or in a caucus so that they can teach other folks how to operate based on what they think are the rules that they want to accept for that session, which is a 2-year session.
I was going to add one thing. Even Michael, you touched on that once you get into a specific committee, then you, in many cases, that committee oversees a department, a state department or agency or something like that. So for example, housing committees. And so on a every other year basis, if you're on that committee, you're also getting information in testimony and reports and stuff from the actual agency. And so you get a lot of information about that. And that sort of is missing a little bit in the context of the work that we're talking about on these calls.
Exactly.
That there's, yeah, go ahead. So
when there's a budget that has to be reviewed every 2 years, legislators get a crash course into the funding, but also the policies related to that funding. And so there's a way to sort of deepen the bench for more people to know more and more about affordable housing issues, or to know more about education or higher education. And so you form that expertise amongst legislators. There is no particular home for tenant landlord law. I mean, it's situated inside the court system, but it also intersects with housing. And then there's also public health aspects. I mean, who's supposed to, there's even jobs that are sort of jobs and economic opportunity sort of seen as a crossover with housing issues in some years. And so tenant landlord law has never really had this permanent home where every couple years legislators are finding out what's the state of tenant landlord law compared to where it has been in the past. And so it takes a lot longer to educate legislators and for them to remember 1 year to the next what are the needs for changes based on their political leanings in tenant landlord law that need to be enacted in the next legislative session. And it's a real frustration because there are people who really, they're in Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's majority renter cities where there are probably some legislators that want to know a lot more about these issues, but there's not a committee, again, that specializes in it, but maybe one that sort of grafts onto it. In this case, there would be, I believe, it'd be the housing policy committees in both the House and the Senate that would take up tenant landlord law issues, as well as the judiciary committees, because that's where the court system is located.
Thanks, Michael. We're all getting our civics lesson today, which is helpful. And it does remind me that yesterday was, I think, National Voter Registration Day. So make sure to register to vote if you're not registered. I put the info about how to learn how to do that online or elsewhere through the Minnesota Secretary of State, because that's your chance to influence who represents you at the state capitol.
Michael, got one more question that I think really is targeted towards you more than me. Is there any way that landlords can try to influence legislators, either at the federal or state level, to try to get, well, ultimately it's self-serving, try to get relief grants for their tenants, but it means that they'll get their rent money too. Is there a way for landlords to get the ear of somebody who tenant advocates might not be able to get the ear of?
Well, yes, and there are multiple ways. One, there is an association, the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, that lobbies at the Capitol on behalf of landlords. And when affordable housing advocates and tenants' rights advocates like Homeline were going to the Capitol and asking for $100 million for affordable housing issues, the Multi-Housing Association was supportive of making sure those resources were received and getting out to people to pay some of their rent. And so there are times where our interests actually intersect between associations, but then most of the time it's tenant and landlord sort of having different perspectives and bringing that to a committee. And again, the Multi-Housing Association is one of the vehicles that is used for that. But also there have been smaller batches of landlords from particular cities that get together and lobby on a particular issue that they think is impacting them. And it's less of a formal organization that takes place than an informal one. But then you can also think that there are landlords that own a lot of properties in a lot of districts, and so they might hold their sway by visiting with the legislators that are in their properties. So within that legislative district. So they have the normal ways that any constituent has to impact the system, all the way up to having an association that takes positions on particular issues that are serving the interests of landlords.
Okay. Eric?
I see a couple more that maybe might relate or Michael
sure.
might have. Could there be an eviction moratorium continued for the sake of renters' health in Minnesota without the governor's peacetime emergency being upheld?
Ask the question again, please. I want to.
I mean, it's just basically right now we're relying on these 30 days.
Peacetime, yeah.
And so, if outside of
yes,
this, is there an argument to be made that an eviction moratorium should be continued in a more permanent fashion?
I see no reason why there couldn't be that argument, and that the governor could propose that. That would be probably much more debatable, and whether or not there'd be the support for that to happen, it'd have to very likely go through the legislative process. I don't know that it could be an executive order or how or what process it would go through. I'm new to the special sessions dealing with executive orders, but it seems to me that this would usually go through a committee process as a legislative effort that the governor would sign or not. But that's my best guess.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah. Do we want to move on, Mike?
We sure can. And Michael, you were welcome to stick around. Maybe take yourself off video and get a drink of something. And if something else comes up, just stick around long enough that if people have a question about what you've covered. But thank you for covering this topic, which we have really, like I said, focused on the landlord-tenant aspects of it almost exclusively. But it's interesting and important to know kind of the broader thought process behind it.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so we had a couple questions submitted in advance that we're going to get to, and then we see a handful in the Q&A.
Yep.
So we'll get to those too, but go ahead and submit your question if you have one. So submitted in advance here. Janelle, please explain squatters who never had a lease and no trespassing signs protecting landlords from unauthorized habitation.
Yeah, so squatters are, I'm not even sure that there's a formal definition of squatters in Minnesota. It's something that we've all heard about through movies, TV, and the media over the years. But I can tell you what defines a tenant in Minnesota. There's actually a state law that defines who a residential tenant is. And it's found once again in the chapter, Minnesota Law 504B.001 is the definitions section. And a residential tenant is somebody who owes rent, basically, for staying in a place. It really is that broad. There are some exceptions, hotels being the most important one that I can think of, because if you think about what a hotel resident does, they pay a fee to get to stay somewhere. So why aren't they a tenant? Well, chances are that that hotel has an innkeeper's license, depending on the city that they're in. So a squatter or is a trespasser, somebody who takes possession illegally, and assuming that they never paid or even owed any rent, they could be removed without an eviction, in theory, if the police are going to enforce that. Now, if they're there a long time, the police might be reluctant to do it. If the landlord has told them, hey, pay me some money or else you can't stay here, is that enough to establish a tenancy? So it's not, I've heard landlords over the years say, oh, I've got squatters here. And you always have to figure out exactly what we mean by that. Is it somebody that moved in with a friend? Is it somebody that ever paid any rent, or did the landlord ever ask for any money? Sort of the key legal question about that is, do they have the rights of a tenant? Because if they do, then right now a landlord couldn't file an eviction for non-payment of rent. If they don't have the rights of a tenant, then they're not eligible for that protection, would be the argument that the landlord would have.
All right. And our next question here. This is from Katie, who self-reports as a landlord.
And we always appreciate that, by the way, when people say sort of what their interest is, social worker, landlord, tenant, it makes it easier to try to answer the question. So thank you for that, Katie.
All right, so we are renewing our rental license and have had issues due to tenants. 2 separate units have been flagged by the inspector due to clutter hoarding situation. Both tenants are refusing to remove the clutter so that we can pass the inspection. 1 unit will more than likely be listed as condemned by the city because it's so bad. If it's not fixed, the rental license will not be renewed. Is this a significant enough property damage to potentially evict? If not, what other options would be available? Are there any situations in which we could go into the unit and clean it ourselves?
So, yeah, Katie's question is obviously a frustrated landlord. I can understand why as well. I think the driving question built into this, though, because there are several questions there, is this a significant enough property damage to potentially evict the tenant? So what Katie's referencing there is the governor's most recent eviction order that includes significant property damage as one of the reasons that a landlord can file an eviction. My concern, let's say I were a landlord attorney for a second and Katie was my client and she said, I want to evict somebody for significant property damage. Okay, tell me what the damage is. Well, they got a lot of stuff. Okay, I'm not sure I hear what the damage to the property is. obviously it's endangering your license, but how is that significantly damaging the property? Just owning and possessing a lot of stuff. If you can show me that they have so much sheer tonnage that it's collapsing the floor, then okay, I think you got a significant property damage argument. But if it's just they have a lot of stuff and the city's hassling us about them having a lot of stuff, I mean, one of those things that Katie's alluding to is that landlords get caught between the city rules that they might have to deal with along with state rules that might play a role. And Katie could be telling the city inspector, hey, look, you can put up a condemnation order. I'm not sure that we can go file an eviction over that. We might get in trouble from the Attorney General's office for filing an eviction for that reason. I have not seen the condemnation versus the you can't file an eviction except for these listed reasons case yet. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I just haven't seen it yet. Partly, I think that's because cities are taking a much more hands-off approach during COVID-19. They're not physically going to as many places for obvious reasons. And condemnations don't happen that often. They just don't, especially for this kind of thing. It takes a lot because the city understands that, hey, look, we've got to be able to convince some judge somewhere, some down the line, that we had the right with the power of the state to go in and remove somebody, to take property away from mostly two parties here, right? We've got the tenant losing their home and the landlord losing their ability to rent to that tenant, which was something that they had a right to before the city showed up and said, hey, there's too much clutter here, you got to get out. So it's not a yes or no answer that I can give you. There's sort of pieces of a spectrum, but again, if I'm a landlord attorney and I'm deciding whether to actually file this case for you, I would be asking you to show me what the significant property damage is, not just sort of the status of what the property looks like.
All right, thanks, Mike. All right, that's the ones we got in advance, and now we're going to jump to some that are in the Q&A. And this person, thank you, just notified us the question about the Fair Housing Act. This person asking the question is a social worker, and their question is: when landlords say they do not work with third-party organizations or nonprofits, housing programs, etc., is this a violation of the Fair Housing Act or something similar to it?
Okay, once again, it's not going to be a yes or no answer here. For instance, in Minneapolis right now, Section 8, probably a protected class. The state Supreme Court said that a landlord can't turn a tenant down because they have Section 8. At least they can't be the only reason that, hey, we're not going to work with Section 8. So there's some cleanup that needs to happen in that case that was just decided last month at the state Supreme Court, or maybe this month. It was very recent. So that would be an example where a landlord couldn't say, or could be in trouble for saying no to a third-party organization. Minnesota does have the receipt of public assistance as a protected class. Just looking at it on its face, I always thought that Section 8 should certainly be part of that. I mean, there's no question it's public assistance. But when that was challenged 7-8 years ago, the Minnesota Court of Appeals said, no, it's still a voluntary program from the federal origins of the Section 8 program. So we're not going to require landlords to comply, but Minneapolis changing that to a requirement now is okay. But let's say you've got some sort of nonprofit that's not a public entity. Could a landlord refuse to work with them? And the short answer is they might be able to, yes. Typically there's more required. There's a specific extra contract between the landlord and that agency. A lot of landlords love working with agencies, especially right now when the market is fluctuating so badly. I think that question might become less and less common as landlords are looking for more certainty when it comes to being paid. Their market rate tenants might not be as good a bet as subsidized tenants, whether that's tenants subsidized through a church or some form of public assistance or a nonprofit as well. So that question might become less important in the next couple of years if the market goes in the same direction that it feels like it's going right now. But the legal answer, the lawyer answer is it would depend quite a bit on the type of program that we're talking about. It's always worth complaining, by the way, to the Department of Human Rights. They can start an investigation to see if they think it does comply. It's free for a tenant to file a complaint like that. And it's not a fast machine, but if it gets moving and they decide there's some discrimination that occurred, it's sort of a steamroller.
Yeah, and then statewide, I put a link to the state statute that sort of part of it, of which covers this area, and including the receipt of public assistance. So if you're in Minnesota, you're covered by that, and so it would be the Department of Human Rights you can send a complaint to. Also, in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, they have their own city departments. In Minneapolis, it's Department of Civil Rights, and so that's another place if the action is taking place in one of those cities. Okay, next question. So this sounds like it's in relation to one of the exceptions under Executive Order 20-79. What would be considered significant damage? What needs to be provided for owner to move back in? If landlords are separating and need the additional home, is that sufficient reason?
Okay, so there's really two questions there. The significant damage, it's not defined any more than that. Significant property damage, I think, is actually the phrase that the executive order uses. And that's going to be in the eye of the judge or the referee that hears the case. As I mentioned earlier, with the person with just a lot of stuff there, a lot of clutter, a hoarding type situation, I wasn't sure that I thought that was significant damage because the property isn't actually damaged. It's just, you know, the status of what's being kept there. Versus, you know, is a rock through a window enough? I mean, that's damage to be sure, right? But if it's $50 to fix it, is that significant property? There's no dollar number cutoff where it defines what significant damage might be. And so a landlord going to file an eviction in this context right now is sort of risking the filing fee, plus if they hire an attorney. Are there landlords out there that are filing evictions just for significant property damage when the rent is not already due? It's a fair consideration. I'm not sure the judge or referee will even actually ask about it if it's not listed in the eviction complaint, which it probably shouldn't be strategically from the landlord's perspective. But it's something that's probably in the back of the mind because judges and referees have heard evictions for decades, some of them, and they might be thinking, well, this is just a pretext to get into court because this tenant isn't paying their rent, and we understand that you're not happy that they're paying their rent, landlord, but we're not going to let you use the significant property damage exception to bypass that rule. So I think, I'm not sure that the you'll know it when you see it answer is the right answer here, but that might be it. You might know it when you see it, and you've got to be able to convince a judge that a family should lose their home potentially because of the damage being significant enough that you can file an eviction for it. The second question, what needs to be provided for the owner to move back in? This is a lot looser. So the landlord has to give a notice in order to do this, at least 7 days, maybe longer, depending on how the lease is worded, in order to retake possession, to move in, or to have a family member move in. But the example that Janelle gave, if landlords are separating, so I assume it's a couple, and one of them wants to live in the additional home, is that a sufficient reason? I don't know why it wouldn't be. There's no list of reasons that are given. All it requires is that it's the landlord or I can't remember if it was relative or family member, the phrasing of it, but that's all that's required. And then the owner or the family member has to take possession within 7 days to show that it was an urgent issue once the tenant is out. So I guess I'm not really sure what the remedy is for the tenant. I guess they could call the Attorney General's office and say, oh, it was just a pretext. And I pulled up the statute. Yeah, it's property owner's family member. It doesn't say relative, just family member. So although those seem like the same thing, they aren't exactly the same item.
It does say due to the need to move.
Yep.
So like they're probably going to have to demonstrate that.
Well, yeah, we've seen cases where the need doesn't need to be really described that heavily. I think it's demonstrated mostly by moving in within the 7 days. If the landlord doesn't do that or their family member doesn't do that, I think that it's a clear violation. So I think the Attorney General's office could go after them at that point.
Yeah, and then the other thing, maybe you covered this, I might have missed it, but on the first thing, that significant damage, again, it says Executive Order 20-79 significantly damages property. The other thing, it has to be a material violation of the lease. So there has to be a lease that points out that significant property damage is a violation of the lease.
Yeah, it does. Most leases have some language like that, if there is a written lease. Not every landlord has a written lease in Minnesota. Maybe our guess is 5 to 7% of leases in Minnesota are handshake deals. Having run a tenant hotline where we've taken 250,000 calls over the years, we're in some position to be able to say, are there oral leases or not? And they're out there. They're just not that common.
All right. Next question. Can we file conciliation court cases for rent, late fees, pet fees, water bills, etc.? This is a landlord, clearly. They have several tenants who've not paid anything for many months. The tenants are saying they have to pay other bills, and the tenants know they can't be evicted. Conciliation court could allow us to have some leverage to get judgment, to get some form of payments and or garnish wages.
Right. So, yeah, I think a landlord can certainly go file a conciliation court case if their county is allowing them to be filed. There's still some variability throughout the state on what is being, whether they can be filed, and probably more importantly, when they'll be scheduled for. I used to be able to say with quite a bit of confidence when a tenant would call us up on our tenant hotline and talk about conciliation court and wonder when am I going to get in court? What day am I going to actually walk through the courtroom doors and have a hearing in front of a judge or a referee? And I could say, like I said, somewhat confidently, 3 to 8 weeks it took to get into conciliation court. Now, what I'm telling people, best guess, these are the tenants that I'm advising about conciliation court, so it's going to be the same for landlords, is I'm guessing that if you file the case now, you're not going to have a case before the end of the calendar year. I mean, we're already late September, so I guess that's not that different than before. But still, I'm talking about, I'm betting 3 months at least, but I don't know when it's going to be heard. It could be a long time before the case gets heard, the conciliation court case. And a landlord wouldn't be putting that much expense out there. Conciliation court costs about $70 to file. So it's a lot less risky financially than an eviction. If you win a conciliation court case, though, as a landlord, that court does not have the power to order the tenant to vacate. Only a housing court or district court would, in Minnesota, have the power to issue a writ of recovery of the premises, which tells the sheriff that they have to go remove the tenant if they refuse to go. Conciliation court can only award the money up to $15,000 is the cap that a landlord or anybody can sue for, or the return of personal property, the legal term for it called replevin. But yeah, conciliation court, a landlord could file it. The actual act of garnishing wages, there's a whole bunch of other steps that a landlord has to go through process-wise, or anybody has to go through to actually collect money from a garnished wage situation. And so it's not fast, and I'm guessing it's even less fast now because these are all court steps that have to be taken, and the court doesn't have to play by the same deadline rules that they had to prior to COVID-19. There's special legislation that was passed that said any specific court deadlines that were in place are going to be relaxed to some degree. So courts aren't as required to get things done in a certain amount of time.
All right, got 10 minutes left here and have a few that have come in, so we'll keep plugging away. Diane asks, can landlords require tenants to wear face masks in common areas?
Yeah, I think a landlord probably could. Well, first of all, there's no question a landlord could do that if this were a new lease. So if a landlord is leasing up with somebody who has never rented from them before, they're moving in October 1, can a landlord have a you must wear masks in the common areas rule in their lease? I don't see any reason why they couldn't. The governor's order, I want to say it is 81.
Yeah, it's 2081. I put the link to that and our FAQ on masks.
Yeah, seems to imply that that's required now under the governor's order. I think there's a decent reading of that. And so can a landlord go file an eviction against a tenant that doesn't wear a mask in the common areas for seriously endangering the property, or not the property, but seriously endangering the safety of others? I suppose a landlord could try it. I think if we change the facts a little bit and we know that the tenant who refuses to wear a mask has COVID-19 currently, and they refuse to wear a mask when they go to the lobby to get their mail, could the landlord file an eviction against them? I think that would be about the strongest case I could think of for masklessness and an eviction that a landlord could file. The landlord could call the police. The landlord could call the Attorney General's office to try to enforce the governor's order as well. So I think the landlord does have some tools to try to use to force tenants to wear masks in common areas, for sure.
And then Linda asks, do homeless encampments become illegal when the peacetime emergency is lifted? So that might be jumping back to when we mentioned that was one of the orders. There was some orders. One of the executive orders is that relies on the peacetime emergency. What I think happened is very early on, when the governor issued the stay-at-home order, there was some provisions in that stay-at-home order, and this is looking back to like April, I think, is when that was happening. Maybe early April. There was a provision that talked about the freedom of people experiencing homelessness to be able to be outside because they don't have another place to go or to get to a shelter, et cetera. And then there was a subsequent order, 20-47, that was issued that clarified some of that and actually does allow law enforcement to address, trespassing or unhealthy, unsafe situations that might occur with an encampment. So it's probably, encampments still are illegal, it appears, but there's maybe just been some flexibility in the way that certain cities or police departments have responded. I don't know if you wanted to add more.
No, that covers it well. Thanks. Not really my area of expertise, so that's great.
Okay, and then Kimberly asks, can we as a landlord file?
Nope, I think we got that.
We got that one. Yeah, that's the same question as before. Okay. And then Robert asks, as a tenant, my landlord refuses to give me certificates of rent paid and has refused to do this for upwards of 10 years I've lived here. They told me I am not entitled to them. I pay rent to them for the space I live in. What can I do to get them, or am I out of luck?
Yeah, and this is a question that we get routinely on the tenant hotline, is about CRPs, credit for rent paid. So the theory behind a CRP is that a landlord gets a property tax rebate, but some of that should go to the tenant because the tenant is contributing to the landlord's income. So they're sort of paying the property taxes directly through the landlord, so they should get some rebate as well. Yeah, Robert, you can contact the State Department of Revenue, the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and they can help you create an affidavit of rent paid, where you can effectively bypass the landlord who won't give you a CRP. So if you have a landlord that refuses to give a CRP, then you can still get some eligibility for the CRP tax break. There are exceptions to who gets a CRP, but it's absolutely worth contacting the Department of Revenue to see if you fall into any of the exceptions. But I have certainly run into, in my career, hundreds of tenants that had landlords, private market rentals, and the landlord said, I just don't think I have to play by that game, and I don't think I have to do that, and I'm not going to do it. I never agreed to give you that, so I'm not going to give you it, but they are obligated to provide the CRP. The state can levy a penalty of $100 against the landlord. That is not a lot, obviously. However, I do think it raises the Department of Revenue's interest level because they wonder if that landlord has been declaring that as income. And so in my mind, that's the real concern that a landlord should have. If the tenant's contacting the Department of Revenue saying I didn't get a CRP, the Department of Revenue might realize that that landlord has not been declaring that rental income, maybe in Robert's case, for 10 years. So that might be the real issue that the landlord has to deal with. But on Robert's side, just being able to get the CRP, that's going to be his solution. I'm not sure how far back he's going to be able to use it for, but certainly for, I think, a couple of years.
Yeah, and I put in the chat the link to information about the refund, including on that second link I sent the rent paid affidavit and actually the information that you need as a tenant when you call the department to receive that. Maybe a follow-up to that question was, can landlords try to withhold your CRP to try to get you to pay for back due rent or damages?
No, landlords cannot hold the CRP hostage for being paid back rent or damages or anything like that. I would absolutely complain to the Department of Revenue about that.
A couple more questions. This one from a social worker. Is it against the law for a landlord to end a lease and or refuse to renew it if the end date is past the current executive order, which right now the peacetime emergency is through October 12th? If a landlord sends that notice, is it a crime or any other penalties?
Yeah, it's a misdemeanor under the governor's current executive order. So we're talking about 79, the one that is the most current eviction order. A landlord can't terminate a lease or end a tenancy. And that fits. The landlord saying, hey, get out at the end of October right now would be saying, well, wait, we don't know if it's going to get renewed or not. But yeah, it seems very clear, and it's different from the original version that the governor's order had, that answers this question much more directly, that a landlord cannot give a future notice to vacate / terminate, non-renew, however you want to phrase it. Notice to quit's another phrase that people use. That seems like a violation that the Attorney General could go after the landlord for. And I believe the Attorney General's office is threatening to go after landlords for that. And it's up to $1,000 and up to 90 days in jail is the penalty for that. Eric, I think you're on mute right now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I put in the chat, I put the phone number and the link to the Attorney General's eviction complaint form.
They are very active in the enforcement of the governor's orders, so it's worth reaching out.
So Mary has a follow-up on the conciliation court question. Even if they get the judgment during the peacetime emergency period, I think most wage garnishments are prohibited until the order is changed or ends.
Yeah, actually, that might be right, Mary. I think I've read stuff about that as well. Doesn't stop the landlord from filing the case, though, is I think what I was trying to answer earlier, which is, can I go file a conciliation court case against a tenant right now, even though I can't file an eviction? And that one, it seems like the landlord certainly can do. Whether they'll actually collect the money, certainly not right now. They might not be able to. But I don't think they're going to actually have a decision and get to the point where they can garnish wages, which is several steps down the road, until sometime next year, maybe mid next year, realistically, before they'll be able to really actively get the money from a tenant's boss. I mean, it wasn't a fast process before COVID-19. It still took months to get to that level. But there's no way it's faster now. Everything's slowed down. But no, it's a good point, and I appreciate it.
All right. I think that tackled the last question that we have. So thanks everybody for joining us again today, and again, thank you, Michael, for sharing your perspective on the peacetime emergency and what's been happening at the legislature.
I could just add one thing. I did put, there's not a post yet, but I have the information available for us to post on the Legislative Commission on Housing Affordability that was asked before. What is the jurisdiction of the committee? And we'll post that as part of the information that's placed for this webinar.
Thanks, Michael. And then just a reminder, we'll do another webinar next Wednesday. That's the September 30th, and probably will mainly be setting aside time for Q&A, And there is one more question that popped up. You want to grab this one, Mike? Or?
We can do that, sure.
All right. So if a landlord's maintenance worker is trying to complete repairs at odd hours, such as working in the evening until 2 or 3 in the morning, what can a tenant do to take action? Is this a privacy violation? In this instance, the landlord's completing repairs in a hurry to avoid further rent escrow actions in court.
Okay. So first thing that pops to mind is there might be a city ordinance that limits when construction work can be done. Sometimes there are hour limitations on such work, so you'd want to check with the city as the tenant about that. If there's a rent escrow actually that's been filed, one of the most common defenses that a landlord uses in a rent escrow case is to say the tenant unreasonably stopped me from being able to access the unit to make the repairs that I needed to make. And so I'd be concerned about that. You want to seem like you're being receptive to this. But I would start by a really transparent paper trail. By that, I mean texts or emails, at least to the landlord saying, hey, I have work at 9 in the morning, or my kid has to go to school at 7:30 in the morning. And your worker was here till 3 in the morning banging on stuff. And so we couldn't sleep until then. I appreciate that you're doing the work, but we got to figure out a time this can be done that's reasonable versus the times that it is being done. And can you stop the guy from working there? That our privacy statute does not have a time window limit in it. Some states do, but in Minnesota there is no specific time parameters when the landlord is allowed to enter the unit. Now, look, there's going to be times if you don't have a working furnace and you've got a furnace person working there till 3 in the morning to make sure that it works and it's January and it's 30 below, you're going to be thrilled that they're working there because the alternative is freezing. But if it's what you described, it's a little harder to accept. But there's no magic time cutoff in the state law about when a landlord can enter a rental unit that would answer that question, like I said. But I would check with the city, see if there's something in there about when people can be doing any kind of construction type work.
All right, thanks, Mike. I just put in the chat the link to the Minnesota State Legislature, the Legislative Commission on Housing Affordability, which Michael mentioned and was asked about earlier. Again, this is a sort of a separate commission looking at this issue that's separate from regular committees, legislative committees that do housing work and hear housing bills. This is specific commission. So with that, we'll call it a day. Again, we'll follow up with registration for next week and the recording from today and various materials that we talked about as well. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.